The history we choose to tell, and how we choose to tell it, is often an expression of the kind of stories we want to believe about ourselves. The historical story we tell tells as much about us as it does about them. This is certainly true in the history of philosophy. Generally, the way that we tell the story of philosophy is to support a narrative that the West, whatever that is rational, enlightened, skeptical, democratic, and analytical, and that there is a chain of tradition anchoring our values and concepts in hallowed antiquity. But just how true is all that? If we look closely at the early origins of philosophy, is that story so simple? I don't think so. This is the second in a series on the history of Western esotericism. In this video, we're going to explore how the foundations of mystical insight, magic, and occult initiation can be found right alongside the foundations of logic, democracy, and rationalism. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and this is Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. In the history of philosophy, we often tell a certain story, and I'm even guilty of telling this story in my classes. And the story goes something like this. Prior to the 6th century BCE, the world was dominated by the category of myth, or mythos, in which the gods were understood to be the origin and arbiters of reality. Then, the Greek miracle occurred. I'm not kidding, there are people that really call it that. And the likes of Hesiod and the irrational mythmongers were confronted and defeated by logos, logic, in the form of philosophy, science, and democracy. The end. Now this is a bit of a caricature, but it's not off the map by much. Think of how many pre- and non-Greek philosophers and scientists you read in your philosophy class. Just ask most philosophers to name a single ancient Egyptian or Mesopotamian thinker or intellectual text. They can't. I don't even think most philosophers even know these texts exist. Further, they're happy to ignore what doesn't fit into this weird, artificial box of logic, rationalism, and strict analytical argumentation. Now, I don't want to discount the dramatic and serious breakthroughs that did occur in ancient Greece. The development of early naturalism, physics, and metaphysics, ethics, etc., and the logical form of argumentation are certainly all there. I don't doubt that, and neither do I want to discount it. I just want to point out that by focusing exclusively on that material, we're missing something very important and just honestly doing our history badly. Alongside these breakthroughs, I want to focus on some aspects of early Greek philosophy that don't fit into this rationalist logical paradigm and argue that this other, more arcane side of philosophy forms at least part of the foundation for Western esotericism. To be sure, I can't cover everything about this development in one video. I think you could do an entire class on the history of early esotericism in Greek philosophy. So I just want to focus in on a couple of figures and concepts in this video. The first being Parmenides and the concept of revelatory initiation, or gnosis, and Pythagoras and the concept of harmonic totality. We'll get to other philosophers in a later video. This is also the first in a series exploring the arcane side of Western philosophy, a topic largely ignored by academic philosophy, much to its own detriment, I think. Most people know Pythagoras of Samos from the theorem attributed to him, although Pythagorean triplets were known centuries earlier in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. What most people don't know is that Pythagoras was one of the first people to call themselves a philosopher. He founded a mystical monastic order. He introduced the concept of reincarnation into the Western world. We know nothing for sure about the early life of Pythagoras. Everything about him and the belief system that he founded is shrouded in legend, lore, and mystery. I want to build out a kind of composite account of what seems to be at least likely. Though even if we can't sort out exactly what was true about him, his beliefs, and the community he founded, we can at least describe what was commonly believed about them in antiquity. He seemed to have thrived in the early 5th century BCE in southwestern Italy. This area had numerous Greek colonies at that time. It appears that he traveled through the Mediterranean basin and seems to have visited Egypt and perhaps Mesopotamia. I guess it makes sense that anyone interested in triangles would visit Egypt. I mean, they kind of had that figured out. Though, in all seriousness, the mathematics of Egypt would have far surpassed anything to have been found in ancient Italy or ancient Greece. Further, and I think this is really key, Pythagoras may have picked up and transformed a key Egyptian idea, the idea of the persistent soul. I say persistent soul because the Greeks already had the idea of a disembodied aspect of oneself that persists after death. But from the Homeric period, this entity is just literally a shadow of oneself. Pythagoras seems to have held that the soul is actually the seat of personality, and that personality actually persists through death. Unlike the Egyptian Ka and Ba, which persist into the afterlife assuming a sinless life, Pythagoras seems to have held the soul actually migrates from life to life, a doctrine sometimes called metempsychosis, transmigration, and reincarnation. In fact, there's a story about Pythagoras hearing the voice of a former friend and the yelping of a dog being beaten. We can also conclude that Pythagoras founded a series of initiatory religious communities in which mathematical, spiritual, and philosophical concepts of greater and greater complexity were revealed to initiates. These communities seem to have had a very complex set of ritual laws around the concept of purity. Famously, Pythagoreans were vegetarians, they didn't eat beans, they wouldn't stand on their fingernail clippings, and they wouldn't urinate facing the sun, among other laws. The core doctrine of the Pythagoreans was panta arithmos, all is number. Although our earliest sources for these concepts is Aristotle, and remember Aristotle is a non-initiate and an opponent of Pythagoras, so we might be a bit skeptical of Aristotle here. There's very little scholarly consensus about just what this is supposed to mean. It seems as if Pythagoreans noticed that nature, from the movement of heavenly bodies to the harmonics of music, was unified by occult mathematical relations. That space and time were fundamentally mathematical and geometrical relations. Built up from infinitely small points flowed the line, then the figure, and then the solid, all placed into the flow of time, infinitely flowing n+1. This idea seems a little odd at first until you take a little physics or study fractals or do a little music theory. It's not a far leap from the idea that mathematics best describes reality to the idea that mathematics just is reality. The Pythagoreans seem to have developed a kind of numero-mystical symbol, maybe the earliest esoteric symbol in the Western world, the tetrachus. The symbol is extremely fecund and probably represents a whole host of secret mathematical mystical doctrines. It begins with a single monad unfolding into 10 different points, the base 10 decimal counting system, containing along the way all the points, lines, and figures which make up the fundamentals of arithmetic and geometry, and by extension, all knowledge, from astrophysics to musical theory. This symbol would persist in esoteric lore through the late classical period and would end up being fused in Kabbalah and Freemasonry. If esoteric and occult symbolism interests you, this might just be the grandfather of all those symbols. Oh yeah, remember when I said that the Pythagoreans may have actually assassinated a guy? There's a legend that Pythagoras actually sentenced one of his own initiates to death by drowning, a guy named Hippasus. One legend actually has Pythagoras himself throwing Hippasus off a boat. What was Hippasus' crime? The discovery of irrational numbers. Either this discovery didn't fit with the Pythagorean worldview, and they sought to suppress the idea, or Hippasus wasn't meant to reveal this kind of knowledge to the public and was assassinated for doing so. The story isn't clear, but it's worth pointing out that even in antiquity, there was an air of secrecy and even danger associated with Pythagorean mysticism. If Pythagoras was the first so-called philosopher, then we can see that philosophy intersected and overlapped what we would now call mysticism and religion. And while ancient sources provide all kinds of colorful legends about Pythagoras and his community, none of them deny that he was a philosopher of the first sort. He's praised as such and more. Iamblichus even declares him as, quote, the leader and father of divine philosophy, and even more, he calls him a, quote, divine man. Many contemporary philosophers actually distance themselves from Pythagoras because of the overt mystical character of his philosophy. Though to one of my professor in graduate school's credit, we did take just as much time with Pythagoras as we did all the other Presocratics, with copious caveats provided. Well, they say, while Pythagoras may have been a sort of weirdo cult leader, no doubt his younger contemporary was certainly a dyed-in-the-wool philosopher. Parmenides of Elea, the founder of metaphysics, was no mystic, right? One of the most obscure and difficult philosophers of all time has to be Parmenides of Elea, who flourished sometime around 475 BCE. Like many of his contemporaries, he was focused primarily on understanding the fundamental structure of reality, what the ancient Greeks called the arcane, out of which all reality was composed and upon which all reality was built. Philosophers prior to him had offered several different solutions to this problem. Thales had argued that everything was fundamentally water, Heraclitus had argued everything was fundamentally fire, Empedocles had argued that there was actually 4 fundamental substances, earth, air, fire, and water, with 2 forces propelling all change, love and strife. Aristotle and many role-playing games have since adopted this physical theory. Parmenides' solution for this problem was as elegant as it is obscure. For him, what fundamentally is being, because otherwise it would have to be no thing or not being, which doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, saying that what is sounds something like a truism. It's like when people say, well, it is what it is. Well, of course it is what it is. But there's actually something really strange going on under the hood of Parmenides' philosophy here. The first really strange consequence of Parmenides' philosophy is that if the only thing that exists is being, and that's the only thing that's really real, then that thing can't change. Because the only change that could occur would be from being to non-being. And if things were changing from being to non-being, well, we would see existence sort of fluttering in and out of existence all the time, which we don't. Existence seems to persist all the time. Well, the immediate question arises, why is it that we experience constant change? It's because we're trusting something that we shouldn't. We're trusting sensation, our opinion. And when we trust sensation, well, sensation can get it wrong. We experience hallucinations all the time. If you look at something in the distance, it appears small. I'm sure all of us have had the experience of our phone vibrating in our pockets and we go to check it and there's nothing. If sensation tricks us all the time, what can we trust? Well, we should trust, according to Parmenides, logos. And this is a really technical, difficult Greek word to translate, but in this case it means something like truth or logic. And according to Parmenides, if we trust what we know to be true, we must conclude that despite all appearances to the contrary, that change is an illusion and that being is the sole unified reality. His slogan, and this is the key link to Western esoteric philosophy, is hin to pan, all is one. We even see this Parmenidean idea in an early alchemical manuscript depicting the Ouroboros, the famous snake eating its own tail. Maybe one of the most famous symbols in Hermetic or esoteric philosophy. Now, how does Parmenides come to this conclusion? The writings that have come down to us are notoriously enigmatic, and often philosophers actually just dive into the second section, the so-called way of truth, and start logic chopping to figure out what Parmenides' actual arguments for this bizarre position is. It's this move, jumping directly to the second section of Parmenides' work, that actually causes us to misappreciate what's actually going on in the thought of Parmenides. Before the second section, on truth, there's a proem, or an introduction. In this proem, something extraordinary plays out. Rather than the image of the solitary, rational philosopher working through their problems using all the tools of logic, we instead have Parmenides being caught up into the heavens on a journey to meet with a goddess who will reveal to him that he must, quote, learn all things, both the way of truth and the way of opinion, or doxa. Parmenides describes how the daughters of the sun escort him to a temple where day and night meet, a place where all opposites resolve into a greater oneness. And an unnamed goddess delivers to him a kind of discourse on the fundamental oneness of reality. What seems to be happening on a straightforward reading of the proem is that Parmenides is, 1, experiencing something like an ecstatic mystical vision in which he is the recipient of a divine revelation into ultimate reality. And 2, Parmenides himself claims that he's something like a vessel through which the goddess speaks to the reader rather than being the author of the ideas. He's a kind of prophet. And 3, the text itself is esoteric. It's very difficult to understand, and it's written as a poem, something very much like many myths or texts about the gods are at this time. While Parmenides' work does include logical argumentation, though obscure, and I have to say that commentaries on this 160-line poem can run into volumes at this point, there can be no denying that on its face, the text is the result of mystical insight and divine revelation. I think it's conspicuous to note that this text is actually very similar in some ways to the Pymander, the first text in the Corpus Hermeticum. We'll be dealing with those texts at length in future videos. There's something ironic about the fact that Parmenides is taken to be one of the foundational characters in the history of Western philosophy, the founder of metaphysics itself. His Sophia seems to be the result of a mystical insight rather than strictly logical argumentation. In my experience, this aspect of Parmenides' thought simply goes either untaught and certainly unstressed, and I think this is just dishonest and a misrepresentation of the history of philosophy. Well, I hope I've shown in these two characters, Pythagoras and Parmenides, that the very foundation of Western philosophy, the alleged rational, logical attempt to discover the fundamental nature of reality, is simply more complicated. There clearly exists a mystical, initiatory, and esoteric aspect at the very root of Western philosophy itself. Both logic and mysticism seem to exist side by side at this period with no apparent contradiction or tension. We, as modern people, insert that tension, or worse, just ignore or suppress the reality of our intellectual and spiritual history. And worse, we do it to our own intellectual and spiritual detriment. If you're interested in the foundations of Western philosophy, or the so-called pre-Socratics in general, although I don't like that term, it seems to lump them all together as if they're similar and just label them as if they're all just before Socrates, which I think is unfair to them. I'd like to recommend a couple of books, specifically on Parmenides and Pythagoras, but also on the pre-Socratics generally, despite that term I don't like. The first collection is by Kirk, Raven, and Schofield. This is a great introduction of the texts with the actual original Greek, a translation, and commentary. Another text published by Hackett, one of my favorite publishers, is Philosophy Before Socrates by McKirahan. It's a great text. It goes over many of the fragments. He does a lot of explaining of the fragments, and it's a really solid text. A great text in the field disrupting this idea that the Greeks were somehow fundamentally rational is The Greeks and the Irrational by Dodds. This is a classic text. The section on Plato and the mania, the idea of madness as the origin of philosophy, is foundational. I highly recommend the Dodds text. Definitely pick that one up. If you're interested in Pythagoras, I hate to tell you, but the best text is relatively difficult to find and very expensive. Walter Burkert's text, Lore and Science in Ancient Pythagoreanism, is in my opinion the best exploration of the doctrines and ideas of Pythagoras and the early Pythagoreans, including Philolaus. It's a bit difficult to find, it's pretty expensive, but if you ILL it, it's great. It's a bit of a tome. It is, in my opinion, the single best text for exploring Pythagoreanism in all its complexity. Another great text on Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, also published by Hackett, is Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans by Charles Kahn. Again, a really great introduction, not terribly expensive. If you can't get the Burkert text, this is also a fantastic text on the difficult nature and the strangeness of the Pythagoreans. If you're really interested in the mystical or mythical side of pre-Socratic philosophy, a fantastic text is Ancient Philosophy, Mystery, and Magic, Empedocles and the Pythagorean Tradition by Kingsley. This does a really fantastic job of exploring these early pre-Socratic philosophers in the context of religion, in the context of mystery religion, in the context of the sort of ancient Greek cult life that existed. Empedocles also, there's all kinds of fascinating stories about him. I think my favorite one is he used to wear golden shoes and allegedly threw himself in a volcano to prove he was a god. I don't know that he survived, but I will say that the literature on Parmenides is very uneven and very difficult. If I were you, I would just stick to the Kirk, Raven, and Schofield text. It has the ancient Greek there, it has the English, and it has a very long, detailed commentary on the Parmenides text. It's a little analytic-y, and I think it downplays the religious and mystical side of Parmenides, but the text is there for you to explore. I hope this video on the origins of philosophy and esotericism as one united form of thought and experience has been interesting. If you're interested in the history of philosophy, especially the esoteric aspects of the history of philosophy, stay tuned. It's going to be a core aspect of what we do here at Esoterica. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.